Sketch woke up that morning the same way he woke up every morning. He stared at the ceiling, he blinked twice, he sat up, scratched the back of his head, and shuffled to the kitchen to make toast. He burned the toast. He always burned the toast. He stood at the counter, staring at the black square of bread, and thought about something he had read the night before. A single sentence that had been stuck in his head like a splinter since he first came across it. The sentence was this: for millions of years, humans ate everything raw. No fire, no cooking, no toast, burned or otherwise. Sketch looked at his burned toast. He looked at it for a long time. Then he scraped it into the trash, sat down at his little desk, opened his notebook, and wrote one question at the top of the page. What did we actually eat before we learned to cook? He underlined it twice. He had been doing this lately, this thing where a single idea would catch him and refuse to let go until he followed it all the way down. His friends found it exhausting. He found it necessary. Because every time he followed one of these ideas far enough, he found something waiting at the bottom that changed the way he understood everything above it. He suspected this one was going to be one of those. He tapped his pencil against the page 3 times and then started writing. The first thing you have to understand, he wrote, is the timeline. And the timeline is enormous. Modern humans have been around for roughly 300,000 years. 300,000. That sounds like a lot, until you learn that the genus Homo, the broader family that includes us, stretches back close to 3 million years. And that fire, the controlled, deliberate, regular use of fire as an actual technology and not just something that occasionally happened near a lightning strike, only became widespread somewhere in the range of 400,000 to 1 million years ago. Sketch stopped writing and drew a long horizontal line across the page. He labeled the right end now. He labeled the left end 3 million years ago. Then he drew a small mark about a third of the way from the right side and labeled it fire. He stared at that mark. Everything to the left of it, that enormous stretch of time that made the period from fire to now look like an afterthought, that was the raw food era. That was what he was interested in. That was the thing nobody talked about because cooking makes for a much more satisfying story. Before and after. Problem and solution. Darkness and light. But before the light, there were millions of years of something genuinely interesting, and Sketch had decided he was going to figure out what it actually looked like. He stood up, he paced, he sat back down. He drew a small stick figure at the far left end of his timeline and labeled it US. Okay, he wrote, let us start with meat. Meat is where the story gets immediately uncomfortable for modern sensibilities. And Sketch had learned that uncomfortable is usually exactly where the interesting things live. Here is the fact that is easiest to understand and hardest to really sit with. The archaeological record contains cut marks on animal bones, marks made by stone tools used to butcher carcasses, at sites dating back at least 2.5 million years. 2.5 million. This means hominins were eating meat for well over 1 million years before fire arrived to help them cook it. Every single piece of meat consumed during that entire stretch of time was raw. There was no other option. It was raw, or it was nothing. Sketch put down his pencil and tried to actually imagine this. He tried to picture what raw muscle tissue feels like to chew. He knew, from experience, the kind of experience you get from eating slightly undercooked steak when you are distracted and impatient, that uncooked meat is genuinely tough. Muscle fibers before heat has had a chance to break down the collagen and soften the structure are not the yielding, flaking, easy-to-manage material that a cooked piece of protein becomes. They resist. They require effort. They require a jaw that is up to the task. And here is where the story of what we ate before fire becomes also the story of how fire changed us physically. Early hominin skulls, the ones that predate cooking, show jaw musculature that is substantially more robust than anything you find in modern human anatomy. Larger muscles, different attachment points. The whole mechanical apparatus of chewing built to handle a consistently demanding load that required real, sustained force. Then, as cooking gradually entered the picture and softened the food, the jaw apparatus softened too. Generation after generation, the extreme musculature became less necessary, and so it faded. Sketch drew a stick figure with an enormous jaw. Then he drew a smaller jaw next to it. Then, an arrow pointing from the big jaw to the small jaw labeled Cooking did this. He stared at it. He thought about all the things that must seem permanent and fixed, but are actually just responses to current conditions. Responses that can shift over long enough timescales when the conditions change. There was also the question of bacterial and parasitic risk, which Sketch did not want to skip past because it is the part of this story that most directly explains what raw meat consumption actually cost. Modern food safety guidelines, the ones that tell you to cook chicken to 165 degrees and to not leave meat out at room temperature, exist because raw and undercooked meat carries genuine pathogens. Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, parasites of several categories. All of these are substantially reduced or eliminated by adequate cooking temperatures. Early hominins had none of that protection. So, how did they survive? Sketch wrote the question and sat with it. Two answers, he decided. The first is that hominin gut physiology in that era was somewhat more aggressive in its pathogen-killing capacity than is strictly necessary for a cooked food diet. A stomach that regularly encounters a high pathogen load and still needs to function develops certain adaptations, a lower pH, stronger immune response in the gut lining, mechanisms that modern humans who have eaten cooked food for hundreds of thousands of generations simply do not need to maintain at full strength, and so have partially lost. The second answer is harder. The second answer is that they suffered. They got sick. They died from food. Not all of them, and not every time, but as a regular feature of existence. Foodborne illness was one of many mortality risks in an environment already characterized by extraordinary background mortality from predators, accidents, weather, and a dozen other categories of hazard. Pre-fire hominins did not eliminate this risk. They absorbed it as part of the cost of existing. Sketch sat very still for a moment. He thought about what it means to live in a world where food is genuinely dangerous and you eat it anyway because there is no other option. He thought about the cumulative weight of that reality across millions of years. He thought about how the modern act of eating, the simple, comfortable transaction of putting food in your mouth and trusting that it will not kill you, is an almost absurdly recent luxury built on top of an enormously long history of that transaction being substantially less certain. He picked up his pencil. There is also, he wrote, the matter of organ meats. And this is where pre-fire hominin dietary strategy reveals something genuinely clever. Organ meats, liver, kidney, brain, and especially marrow are considerably softer and more mechanically tractable than muscle tissue. They require far less chewing effort to consume raw, while simultaneously offering extremely high concentrations of specific nutrients. A brain is essentially already processed from a mechanical standpoint, a rich, dense, fatty organ that can be consumed with minimal effort. Liver is similar. Marrow, accessed by breaking open bones with stones, is essentially pure fat, calorically dense, and immediately available once the bone is cracked. The archaeological record is full of percussion marks, the distinctive damage patterns left by stone tools used to strike bones and crack them open. These marks are concentrated specifically on the bones of large-limbed animals, the bones most likely to contain substantial marrow cavities. Early hominins were not just eating whatever was easy to access on the surface of a carcass. They were specifically targeting the interior of bones for the concentrated caloric payoff inside. This is strategy. This is planning. This is a species that has assessed the available resources and worked out, through accumulated experimentation across generations, which parts are worth the effort and which parts are not. Sketch drew a stick figure crouching over a bone, hammerstone in hand, cracking it open with practiced purpose. He labeled it. They knew what they were doing. There was also the question of scavenging, which Sketch spent some time on, because it has specific and slightly unsettling implications for what pre-fire hominins were actually eating in practice. A substantial body of evidence suggests that early hominins, particularly in the earlier phases of the genus Homo, relied significantly on scavenging, accessing carcasses that had already been killed by other predators rather than making the kill themselves. This is not a shameful strategy. It is an extremely common one among large mammals, operating in environments with abundant large predators who do the energetically expensive work of killing and then leave behind more calories than they can immediately consume. But scavenged carcasses vary. A fresh kill accessed quickly after the predator has moved on is different from a carcass that has been sitting in the sun for 2 days. Many scavenging species, hyenas, vultures, certain beetles, regularly consume meat well into advanced stages of decomposition without apparent harm. Their digestive systems are specifically equipped for this. And the practical reality of a scavenging-dependent diet almost certainly meant that pre-fire hominins consumed at least some meat that modern food safety standards would characterize with a very long list of alarmed adjectives. They ate it anyway. The whole picture of pre-fire meat consumption that emerges is of a species negotiating constant risk, deploying genuine strategic intelligence to minimize exposure where possible, and simply absorbing the residual costs where not thriving in some idealized natural state. Managing, adapting, persisting. Sketch stood up again. He walked to his window and looked outside at the street, at the ordinary morning traffic of people moving through a world where food safety is largely handled by someone else, by inspectors and temperatures and refrigeration and supply chains and regulations developed across decades of figuring out what actually kills people. He thought about what it would be like to exist without any of that buffer, to face the fundamental transaction of eating as a genuine negotiation with biological risk every single time. Then he went back to his desk. Because the plant side of this story, he had realized, is where things get philosophically interesting in a different way. Plant foods almost certainly represented the bulk of caloric intake for most hominin populations across most of this period. Meat was important, but available plant material was more reliably accessible and less immediately dangerous to pursue. The question is what the raw plant diet actually looked like and what it could and could not deliver. And here is the problem. Sketch wrote it slowly, testing each word as he set it down. The most calorically dense plant foods available to early hominins, tubers, roots, underground storage organs, the things that store concentrated energy in forms that stay available through seasonal variation, these foods contain starch. And raw starch, starch that has not been processed by heat, is substantially harder for the human digestive system to extract energy from than cooked starch. This is because of structure. Raw starch exists in a crystalline form that digestive enzymes have considerable difficulty accessing. The process of cooking, specifically the gelatinization that occurs when starch granules are exposed to heat and moisture and swell and rupture, dramatically increases the surface area available to digestive enzymes and correspondingly increases the caloric yield per gram of starchy food eaten. Studies measuring the actual caloric extraction from raw versus cooked starchy foods find meaningful differences. A meaningful percentage of raw starch can pass through the human digestive system essentially undigested, providing almost no caloric return on what might have been a significant foraging investment to acquire. This creates a puzzle, a real one. If the most energy-dense plant foods were substantially less efficient to extract energy from before cooking, how did pre-fire hominins meet their caloric needs from plant sources? Sketch drew a series of plants. He drew a tuber, a fruit, a handful of leaves, a nut. Then he started crossing things out. Several mechanisms appear to have been involved. First, mechanical processing short of cooking does provide real benefit. Pounding and mashing food with stones increases the surface area exposed to digestive enzymes and breaks open cellular structures in ways that improve extractability. It is not as efficient as gelatinization from heat, but it is meaningfully better than swallowing something whole. Early hominins were almost certainly spending significant time preparing plant food with stones before eating it, not just eating and moving on. Second, fermentation. Whether deliberately managed or simply an inevitable consequence of plant foods sitting in warm conditions for periods of time, natural fermentation provides another mechanism for improving digestibility without fire. Predigestion by microorganisms that do the biochemical work that heat would otherwise do. Third, and this one reshapes the picture substantially, early hominins almost certainly relied more heavily on plant foods that did not present the starch digestibility problem in the first place. Ripe fruit contains sugars in forms that are directly absorbable without enzymatic breakdown. Nuts and seeds contain fats and proteins that do not face the same raw versus cooked efficiency gap. Food material provides fiber and certain micronutrients without requiring high caloric extraction to be worth eating. This suggests the pre-fire hominin plant diet was substantially different in emphasis from the post-fire diet. More fruit, more nuts, more seeds. Relatively less reliance on starchy underground storage organs, not because hominins did not know about tubers and roots, but because tubers and roots were dramatically harder to extract real value from before heat transformed their internal structure. The tuber, Sketch wrote slowly, became dramatically more valuable after cooking. He underlined it. He thought about this for a while. The idea that cooking did not just make food safer and more palatable, though it did both of those things, but actually transformed entire categories of food from marginally useful to genuinely important. The landscape of available calories changed. New resources became viable. The math of what was worth foraging for shifted in ways that would have rippled outward into everything, where people traveled, what territories were worth defending, how much time in a day could be freed from foraging to do other things. But that is the cooking story. He was still in the before. He flipped to a new page. Let us talk about insects, he wrote. Because insects get consistently underrepresented in popular discussions of ancient diets, and they deserve considerably more attention. Insects represented an extremely accessible, reliable, and nutritionally dense food source that required no cooking to be both palatable and nutritionally useful. Studies of contemporary great apes, particularly chimpanzees, document extensive and sophisticated insect foraging behavior, including the use of modified sticks to extract termites from mounds and ants from nests. The behavioral sophistication involved in making and using these tools, selecting the right material, modifying it to the right length and flexibility, deploying it with the appropriate technique, is not trivial. These animals have figured out something worth figuring out. Termites are roughly 60% protein and 30% fat by dry weight. Ants offer similar nutritional profiles. Beetle larvae, the soft, fat-rich grubs found in decaying wood, are extremely calorie-dense. These are not emergency foods eaten only when nothing better is available. They are high-quality, reliable nutrition sources that require no fire, relatively minimal processing, and are available year-round in many environments in quantities sufficient to represent a genuinely meaningful dietary contribution. Sketch drew a stick figure sitting cross-legged next to a termite mound, carefully inserting a long, thin stick into an opening. Patient, methodical, not desperate, strategic. He labeled it. It was a good idea. Honey deserves a separate note, Sketch wrote, because honey is special. Honey is an essentially pre-processed concentrated sugar source that can be consumed with full digestive efficiency immediately with no preparation whatsoever. The human caloric payoff from honey is immediate and substantial. The challenge is not eating it, but getting it. Since wild honey is defended by bees whose interest in keeping the honey is essentially infinite and whose tools for communicating this interest are numerous and pointy. But the archaeological evidence for honey consumption among early hominins and even Neanderthals exists, and the cognitive and behavioral sophistication required to plan and execute a honey raid, including tolerance of significant immediate pain in service of a caloric payoff that is real but delayed, is exactly the kind of behavioral flexibility that characterizes our lineage throughout this period. Sketch stopped writing. He sat back. He realized he had been writing for 3 hours and had not noticed. He made tea. He burned the tea. He set it aside and thought about gut anatomy. Because the human gastrointestinal tract, he had come to understand, preserves a kind of physical record of this entire dietary transition, a record written in tissue. The human colon is, relative to body size, notably smaller than the colon of our closest living primate relatives. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and other great apes have proportionally much larger intestines, particularly the large intestine. This makes sense for a species that derives a significant portion of its energy from fermentation of plant fiber in the hindgut, a process that requires substantial surface area and considerable time. Our colon is smaller. We rely less on hindgut fermentation. We extract our calories through different mechanisms upstream. The leading explanation for why our gut shrank is cooking. The argument, developed by researchers including Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler, in what they called the expensive tissue hypothesis, goes like this. The human brain is metabolically expensive. It consumes roughly 20% of the body's resting energy budget, despite being only about 2% of body weight. Running a brain this large costs something. And the hypothesis holds that part of what it cost, the metabolic space that was freed up to pay for it, came from the reduction in gut size that cooking made possible. A cooked diet is a pre-processed diet. Heat has already done a substantial portion of the digestive work before the food ever enters the body. Collagen has broken down. Starch has gelatinized. Cell walls have softened. The gut does not need to be as large or as energetically demanding to extract adequate nutrition from food that has already been chemically transformed by heat. So, the gut shrank, and the metabolic resources that the larger ape-like gut would have consumed became available for other uses, including, possibly, building and running a brain that was larger than any primate brain had been before. Sketch drew this as a diagram. A big gut with a small brain bubble above it. An arrow pointing right to a small gut with a large brain bubble. The arrow labeled fire. He stared at it for a long time. The implication is genuinely significant. It suggests that the cognitive leap that eventually produced modern human intelligence was not simply a matter of natural selection acting on brain tissue in isolation. It was enabled by an interdependency, a co-evolution of technology and anatomy in which a behavioral innovation, cooking, fed back into physical form and made possible a biological change that then made possible further cognitive innovation. We did not just cook because we were smart. We got smarter, at least in part, because we cooked. And before we cooked, Sketch wrote, the hominins who eventually became us were operating under a different set of constraints, a larger gut. A harder working digestive system extracting calories from food that had not been pre-processed by heat. Less metabolic flexibility. Tighter margins between what was available and what was needed. Not less intelligent. Not less capable. Not some lesser version awaiting completion. But operating with a different balance of biological resources and behavioral compensations than would eventually become available. He turned to a fresh page. Teeth, he wrote. The microscopic study of ancient teeth has been one of the more productive methods for understanding pre-fire diets, because teeth preserve a detailed physical record of what they have been used to chew. Microwear analysis, examining the patterns of scratches and pits left on tooth enamel under high magnification, can distinguish between the mechanical signature of different food types. Hard, brittle foods leave different marks than tough, fibrous materials. Gritty foods leave different patterns than smooth ones. The results from early hominin fossil teeth consistently support a diet involving substantial mechanical demands consistent with raw, tough, fibrous material. This is not surprising, but it is confirmatory. A physical record embedded in bone that lines up with the theoretical picture, built from other evidence. More interesting is the variation. Not all early hominins show identical wear patterns. The genus Paranthropus, a lineage of robust-jawed hominins that coexisted with early Homo species for a substantial period before eventually going extinct, shows dental and jaw morphology suggesting extreme specialization toward very tough, fibrous plant material. The chewing apparatus is massive. The molars are enormous. This is a lineage that went deep into anatomical specialization for one particular dietary strategy and paid the costs of that commitment in reduced flexibility. The lineage that eventually led to modern humans made a different bet. Instead of extreme anatomical specialization, this lineage maintained greater anatomical flexibility and compensated with behavioral flexibility. Better tools, more diverse food strategies, greater capacity to shift emphasis when local conditions changed. The eventual Paranthropus extinction and the eventual success of our lineage is not just a story about who had bigger teeth. It is a story about whether you bet on the body or bet on the brain when the environment demands adaptation. The ones who bet on the brain won. Sketch drew two stick figures, one with an enormous jaw and rigid posture, one smaller, more adaptable looking, holding a stone tool. He labeled the first one, specialized. He labeled the second one, flexible. He drew an X through the first one. Then he sat with that for a while, because there is something in this pattern that feels relevant beyond paleo anthropology. Every domain of complex problem solving contains versions of this choice. The specialist who is extraordinarily effective in one specific context, but brittle when conditions shift. The generalist who is less optimal in any particular context, but resilient when the landscape changes. Pre-fire hominin evolution ran this experiment across millions of years with the stakes of actual survival and the sample size of entire species. And the result was unambiguous. In an uncertain, variable world, flexibility wins. Sketch's tea had gone completely cold. He did not care. He was thinking about water. It sounds like an odd thing to get absorbed in when you are trying to understand a dietary world, but water connects directly and importantly to the broader picture of what pre-fire survival actually required. And he had realized that he had been thinking about food in isolation when the reality was much more interconnected than that. Fire, once it became available, did not just transform food. It also transformed water safety in ways that are easy to overlook when you are focused specifically on what people ate. Boiling kills the vast majority of waterborne pathogens: bacteria, protozoa, parasites, the kinds of organisms that live in rivers, streams, ponds, and any other natural water source that is also used by other animals and that sits in sunlight and accumulates biological material over time. Before fire, hominins drinking from these sources had no mechanism for reducing that pathogen load. This means the health burden of the pre-fire era was not limited to food-specific risks. It extended across every category of ingested substance. Eating was risky. Drinking was risky. The baseline disease environment was genuinely demanding in ways that go beyond anything modern humans in developed countries have direct experiential access to. Sketch drew a small stream. He drew a stick figure kneeling next to it, cupping water. He drew question marks floating in the water. Not dramatic, just honest. Then, he started thinking about storage. Because the inability to preserve food is another dimension of pre-fire existence that reshapes everything about how daily and seasonal life must have been organized. Without fire, and specifically without the smoking and drying techniques that fire eventually made possible, pre-fire hominins had genuinely limited options for preserving food beyond its natural shelf life. Meat from a large kill or scavenged carcass would begin decomposing relatively quickly, particularly in warm climates. This creates real pressure. A large amount of meat that cannot be preserved is meat that must be consumed quickly or wasted. And here is where the pre-fire dietary story becomes also a social story. If a large kill cannot be effectively preserved, the optimal strategy becomes rapid, wide distribution and consumption across as many individuals as possible. Not just because sharing is cooperative and cooperation is valuable, though it is, but for the simpler and more immediate reason that the food will be gone in days, regardless of what you do, and sharing it builds the kind of reciprocal social obligations that prove valuable when someone else has the large kill next time and you are the one who needs to eat. The reciprocal meat-sharing behavior documented extensively in modern hunter-gatherer ethnography, the social architecture of obligation and generosity around food, may have origins that predate fire entirely. Driven initially not by cultural sophistication, but by the simple, thermodynamic reality that warm climate unsmoked meat rots fast, and the only alternative to sharing is watching your calories disappear. Different food categories had different natural storage properties. Nuts and seeds, with low moisture content and protective shells, could sit for extended periods without active preservation technology. This gave them a particular strategic value beyond their immediate nutritional content. A food you can cache and return to is worth more than its caloric content suggests, because it provides a reliable buffer across time in ways that more perishable foods cannot. Tubers, interestingly, store themselves. Underground storage organs are evolved biological structures specifically designed to maintain nutrients through dormant periods. Many tuber varieties can remain viable and edible in the ground for extended periods without requiring any intervention from foragers at all. The ground is the refrigerator. Leave it there until you need it. This natural storage capacity would have given underground plant material genuine strategic value as a reliable, returnable resource, even in the pre-fire era. When extracting maximum caloric value from it required the additional step of mechanical processing that cooking would eventually replace. Sketch drew a cross-section of soil with a tuber sitting underground, labeled Nature's Pantry. Then he drew a stick figure walking past it knowingly, not harvesting, just noting it, planning to come back. That is behavioral sophistication. That is mental mapping of resources across time and space. That is a cognitive capacity that requires holding information about future resources in mind and making present decisions based on future expectations. It is not simple. He looked at his notebook. He had filled most of it. The pages were covered with diagrams and arrows and labels and marginal notes that connected things to other things in ways that were becoming increasingly elaborate. He turned to the last few clean pages. Chimpanzees, he wrote. Because the most direct window we have into what raw food primate life actually looks like in practice is not the fossil record. It is the living species we share the largest portion of our evolutionary history with. And extensive, long-term field studies of wild chimpanzee populations conducted across multiple research sites in Africa over several decades have documented a dietary world that is far more sophisticated and varied than popular imagination typically grants. The dietary range observed in chimpanzee populations at some research sites encompasses well over 100 distinct plant species, supplemented by insects, supplemented by opportunistic and active meat consumption. The behavioral complexity involved in tracking and managing this range of resources across seasonal variation is genuine. It requires accumulated environmental knowledge. It requires planning. It requires the ability to assess what is currently available, what is becoming available, and what has recently been depleted, and to adjust strategy accordingly. Chimpanzee hunting behavior specifically has been studied in detail, and what researchers have found is not opportunistic scrambling after whatever small animal happens to wander close enough. It is coordinated group behavior with role differentiation. Drivers who move prey in a particular direction, blockers who cut off escape routes, capturers positioned to intercept. The strategy is apparent, the coordination is real. And the meat-sharing behavior that follows a successful hunt, with hunters and specific social partners receiving portions according to patterns that have social and relational logic, mirrors in genuinely interesting ways the meat-sharing patterns documented in human hunter-gatherer societies. If chimpanzees, without any fire and without stone tools, beyond simple unmodified sticks, are capable of this level of organized resource acquisition and structured social distribution, it provides strong grounds for inferring that early hominins, who shared a recent common ancestor with chimpanzees and possessed at minimum comparable and likely somewhat greater cognitive sophistication, were operating at least at this level of behavioral complexity in their own raw food strategies. We did not wait for fire to become capable. We were already capable. Fire just changed what we could do with the capability we had. Sketch wrote that sentence and then stopped. He read it back. He thought about all the things we sometimes treat as the beginning of the real story: fire, agriculture, writing, industry, digital technology, and how each of these innovations is easy to frame as the moment when capability was finally established. When the waiting was finally over, when things finally became possible. But the honest reading of the pre-fire story, he thought, is that capability was already there. The behavioral flexibility, the strategic thinking, the accumulated environmental knowledge, the social coordination, the willingness to take intelligent risks in pursuit of caloric payoff. All of that existed before fire gave it a dramatically better toolkit to work with. The tool did not create the intelligence. The intelligence found the tool. Sketch set down his pencil. He looked at his notebook. He looked at the long horizontal line he had drawn hours ago, with now on the right, and 3 million years ago on the left, and the small mark labeled fire, sitting a third of the way from the right. The stick figure he had drawn at the far left end was still there, small, simple. A circle for a head, 4 lines for limbs. He had labeled it US. He picked up his pencil and drew a line connecting that far left figure to a figure at the far right. Same circle. Same 4 lines, also labeled US. Then he looked at everything in between. 2.5 million years of stone tools and butchered carcasses, percussion marks on ancient bones from hominins extracting marrow with deliberate purpose, termite mounds with holes worn into them from repeated tool extraction, dental, microware, recording the mechanical demands of a raw food world on the enamel of teeth that belonged to individual people, actual individuals, who woke up one morning, at some point between 3 million years ago and 1 million years ago, hungry, in a world without kitchens and figured out what to do about it. Those individuals never became famous. Their names, if they had names in any sense we would recognize, are gone. Their faces are gone. What they thought about while they cracked open bones with stones and extracted marrow with their fingers is entirely inaccessible. But the record they left is real. The cut marks are real. The percussion marks are real. The shaped stone tools are real. The reduction in gut size that their descendants eventually achieved is real. The robust jaw that slowly became our more modest jaw is real. The expanded brain that required a smaller gut to make metabolic room for itself is real. All of it is a record. A record of millions of years of hominins eating without fire, and doing so not passively, not desperately, not stumbling through some pre-civilized deficiency, but with genuine behavioral sophistication, accumulated knowledge, strategic flexibility, and the willingness to persist through genuine risk and genuine cost in pursuit of survival. It is the longest experiment in behavioral intelligence ever conducted, and it happened before anyone thought to keep a light burning. Sketch closed his notebook. He stood up. He stretched. He walked back to his kitchen. He looked at his toaster. He put 2 pieces of bread in it and watched them carefully this time, popping them up just before the edges started to darken. He buttered them and ate them standing at the counter, looking out the window at the ordinary morning that had somehow, in the 3 hours since he first started writing, become afternoon. The toast was perfect. He ate it and thought about the 2.5 million years between the first stone tool marks on a bone and the moment when someone, somewhere, figured out how to control fire well enough to use it reliably for cooking. He thought about everything that happened in that gap. All the meals, all the strategies, all the seasonal adjustments and resource assessments and social distributions of large kills that could not be preserved and had to be shared or wasted. He thought about the hominin standing at the edge of a savanna somewhere in Africa, holding a stone, looking at a carcass, making a calculation. Same problem as always. Where are the calories? How do I get to them? What risks am I willing to absorb? What can I carry back? Different tools than we have, different risks, different available options. Same underlying intelligence doing the work. He finished his toast. He washed the plate. He went back to his desk, opened his notebook to a new page, and wrote one question at the top. What else happened before the things we call the beginning? He underlined it twice. He had a feeling this was going to take a while.